So it's necessary for us to take a moment and look at policy theory and practice so that we are able to understand exactly what policy making is, and so that as we do our policy analysis, we can see whether it is operating in a way that isn't hoped for and expected. As we saw earlier, uh, when we talk about policy change, for the most part, we see very little policy change. The status quo is something that's very protected in American policy making. Theories of policy change often involve windows or punctuated equilibria or focusing events. In short, we mean something that changes suddenly, that makes the policy salient and the problem something of everyone's concern. And while we look at this as an agenda setting approach, it might be saying that, nothing changes except when things change. Well, we don't want to be caught making no predictions. We need to have some idea of when and why something might change. But certainly things change more when the problem is brought to attention. Now, referring back to the previous module, remember we talked a little bit about Kingdon and the three streams approach. Um, this comes from his book, Agendas, Alternatives, and Public Policies. And one thing to keep in mind is that in order for something to reach the public agenda, there needs to be recognition that there's a problem. This is why I want so much for your policy analysis paper to look at and isolate the policy problem. Because unless you see that there's a problem, all of your alternatives really just look like ideas in search of something to be used for. There must be alternatives that are technically feasible. So it's not just that there needs to be a problem, there also needs to be alternatives, and there needs to be political will. And without this political will, it doesn't matter that there's a problem and a solution. There needs to be a desire to match those together. And so these all operate independently, and it's only when they come together that we predict that there'll be a new policy. Now, a very popular approach to this is the so-called punctuated equilibrium model. Baumgartner and Jones built on an older model from Cobb and Elder and said that change rarely occurs, but sometimes there's a huge change that occurs all at once, a paradigm-altering leap. Interestingly enough, this is what people now believe occurs in evolution, right? We don't believe in a slow, steady progress, but we see that at moments of crisis, species either adapt or they die out. Often we're associating this policy change with a major event that raises issue saliency. The recession of 2007, 2009, Hurricane Katrina, coronavirus. Something happens which draws attention. Several of the readings in this module consider punctuated equilibrium. And I know that we're at a point where there's a lot of things going on and a lot of material to cover. I would hope that anything that you decide you're not going to read now, that you set aside and you promise yourself that you're going to read later, to whatever extent that you hope to someday be aware in the area of public policy. As you investigate the concept of punctuated equilibrium, you might enjoy noting that, I already said that, that it's the dominant theory for evolution. Quite often what we see in public policy is we see metaphors that are associated with things like species and um, evolution, extinction, and such. The dominant theories of interest groups, for instance, are all ecological in nature. So there's 5 stages of policy making. We call this a heuristic or learning tool. Really, policy making can begin at any step. If you're aware of the wheel of science, right? Sometimes observation leads to theory, sometimes theory leads to predictions that we then observe to see whether they're true or not. Well, in the area of stages of policy making, we often talk about agenda setting first, and certainly it has to reach the agenda at some point. We talk about policy formulation. In practice, policies are always sitting around on the shelf for people to take out, make particular to a particular problem and solve it. Adoption, when one of the alternatives is chosen. Implementation, these are the rules for carrying out the policy and the introduction and change to those affected. And then finally, evaluation. Did it work? Notice, though, that this is very similar to the steps for policy analysis. At least when we talked about the steps, Bardock extends even beyond. So sometimes, right, sometimes it's hard for political scientists to admit this, but most people don't pay attention to politics most of the time. Even those who care don't care about everything equally. There's people you would be surprised who spend all of their time trying to figure out how best to make sure that the children of a school district are properly educated, and if you ask them about clean air, they'll say, never really thought about it, or vice versa. Politicians have an incentive to care about the issues that the public already cares about. Because if you're a politician, you're a generalist and you have to worry about everything. So you don't have time to focus on things that nobody else cares about, or they start to say things like, well, he was absent when it came time to focus on the things that the people really cared about. And the actual formulation of policy alternatives is often left to policy entrepreneurs, people who specialize, people who care about the issue and put up their own resources to get it onto the agenda. So one of the interesting things about the United States is our federal system. And if you are a policy entrepreneur, if you are somebody seeking to bring a policy to the agenda, you're actually going to venue shop, or you're going to look around and try to find the place where if you take the policy there, it is likely to get attention. If you can get it onto the agenda somewhere and you can get it adopted somewhere, then it helps you sell that policy somewhere else. Just like if you were a salesperson and you said, look what we were able to do for this guy with his retirement, for instance. Don't you want us to try to do this for you? This does mean you have to win in all of the different places, and so sometimes it is designed to slow or prevent policy change. And actually, though, that this really runs counter to one of the things that we see as a characteristic of how people operate within the policy system. Anthony Downs, who is probably one of the greatest political scientists of all time, noted that people tend to lose interest in a policy. They tend to not look over the shoulder of politicians. So slow change leads to a decline in saliency, and thus when the saliency falls, the chance for reform falls as well. This idea is actually referred to today as Downsian mobilization. And we talk about this. I put 7 steps. There could be slightly more, slightly less, depending on how you divide these up. But it says an issue reaches the public agenda with a great deal of attention and saliency. It's often after a major event, so it's not in any way counter to this idea of punctuated equilibrium. Policy change is most likely at this point. Everybody's paying attention. Everybody sees that there's a problem that desperately needs to be solved. But now you're on the clock. The public and politicians celebrate the win. You get something adopted. And then people tend to lose interest. Or the policy change fails and people give up. So either everybody loses interest because yay, we won, let's all go home, or people lose interest because we lost and everybody goes home. With attention of the policy falling, the policy making begins to fall within the parameters set by the institutions that already exist. And so whatever happened, whatever was set up or changed in terms of the institution when the new policy was adopted becomes the actual important thing. Because we lose interest, but what new rules have we set up that will govern the incremental change that is going to occur over the next however long until the policy reaches the agenda again. So if we have put in, for instance, a Department of Justice that is empowered to register voters, and then we all lose interest, well, as long as the Department of Justice does that, then a few more people will continue to be registered to vote. If what we do is not give that charge to the Department of Justice, then it's unlikely that they will take this of their own volition and start to do it. And the process won't begin again unless there's a new force leading to mobilization. Now, when I was at Michigan State, I had a professor, Dr. Sandra K. Schneider, and interestingly, she wrote a really good book called Dealing with Disaster, Public Management in Crisis Situations. And not only do I highly recommend it, it was about hurricanes and stuff, but looking at it again and how it interacts with coronavirus, I think you might find particularly interesting. Dr. Schneider once asked students visiting from Romania whether Downsian mobilization, which we just talked about, whether it is something that is common in Romania. And the 2 students looked at each other, and you could see that they found it an amusing question, and they agreed. And one of them said that nobody in Romania is ever optimistic about policy change. We laughed, and it makes you wonder, which of Downs's assumptions are unique to the U.S. or to Romania. And so we should recall that we're probably talking primarily about American public policy here. Rules and restrictions may be different within the boundaries of your political area. Which leads naturally to a discussion of institutions. Institutionalism is the approach to public policy that suggests outcomes are constrained by the institutional arrangements within the policy area, and that this is the leading predictor of outcomes. So there's many different perceptions of what institutionalism is. So I sought a reading that would help us understand the different views of institutionalism. And I found this article by Simon Reich from 2000 called The 4 Faces of Institutionalism, Public Policy, and a Pluralistic Perspective. And what's great about this is not that Simon Reich was the first person to envision this. That's not true by any stretch. But what's great about it is that he looks at and gives an overview of the leading institutions that are the institutional perspectives that researchers have used across time and are still popular today. Now, one of the best of these, the most explanatory of these, tends to be historical institutionalism. And it values the contribution of time and experience in understanding the role of institutions. Rules, constraints, responses across time structure organizational decision making. There's a term called path dependence. Once you start down a certain path, you tend to continue to follow it to completion. Past processes, default patterns, an organization's understanding of itself are seen through a prism of practice. We do what we do. And considerable attention to repeated behavior is important in this understanding. Now remember, you could be a historical institutionalist not because you believe that historical institutionalism and path dependence and such are good things. You might view them as bad things, as challenges to democratic theory, for instance. Yet say, this sure seems to be the way the world works. Now, in this course, we often focus a good deal on economic institutionalism, sometimes called rational choice institutionalism, because it's closely aligned with rational choice theories. Munger, who we were introduced to in the last section, is an economic institutionalist. Stone is not. Stone is the opposite. There's a strong emphasis on rules, incentives, and utility maximization, or the idea of getting the best benefit possible. This approach uses decision process modeling, which is to say, you actually look at the process of decision making, you determine what the benefits and costs are at each step along the way, and game theory to predict outcomes. Tragedy of the Commons, the prisoner's dilemma, the chicken game. This is often the most accepted approach amongst policy analysts, at least on paper. The game that we play, the tools that we utilize are often about conducting cost-benefit analyses and saying, well, what is the thing that will lead to the best outcome? Now, without saying that Stone is a sociological institutionalist, it is fair to say that her work is consistent with a lot of what sociological institutionalism said. It rejects a strict adherence to rationality. It focuses on institutional cultures and the unique characteristics of each institution. This approach borrows heavily from cultural and subcultural studies to examine the role of myth, cognitive templates, norms of behavior, morality, and ethical expectations. Stone's most comfortable here. The problem is it's a little bit less predictive. The more you've read of Stone, the more you've probably recognized already that she doesn't so much tell us what's going to happen in any particular case as she tells us the things that we need to be thinking about as possible, that we need to reimagine some of the wording that we use. And that is very much consistent with this idea that the meaning that people gather from policy making bodies is as important as any actual hope for rational decision making. If you read Stone, you realize that she says that this rationality project is itself a set of rules and beliefs and norms that people adopt, and they don't realize that they're doing something other than just than just following a neutral process. There are no neutral institutions, sociological institutionalists would say. Now, of a fourth approach we might call a political actors approach to institutions, or almost an institutionalism, right? Institutions have a self-awareness and the power to behave strategically. They have agency, we often say. Institutions work to maximize outcomes not for the stakeholders or the policy, but for the organization itself. They're aware of the need to perpetuate themselves. You see this, for instance, in education, right? We often say we are going to become what people are asking us to become. We are going to teach practical skills, for instance, rather than, early 20th century, we're going to teach Latin and we're going to teach philosophy, right? Well, now almost nobody takes either of those courses. Why? Because universities have sought to become avenues for success based on what people thought they needed from the universities. Institutions are often insulated from outside pressures. Sometimes they're not. That often causes them to act in a certain way when they are. But they probably seek to eliminate their saliency. Remember, we looked at Downs and we said when the issue's not salient, then people are left to their own devices. Max Weber said that institutions cohere. We might say they reach self-awareness. They reach self-awareness and they have goals and aspirations. So this leaves us a lot to consider. Many of the ideas work best when used to structure your understanding of what you see in policy research. Particularly when you're looking at the institutionalism, try to find in what is being advocated in institutional approach. You're trying to understand policy by looking at the policy from the lens of one or more political theories. And for the sake of your learning, you need to look backward as well and test your assumptions about political theories given what you are seeing in your policy research. It's useful. Maybe you'll see that one side or another is correct. Or maybe you'll see that borrowing from Stone, or borrowing from Munger, or borrowing from Coase, or some other person that we're studying this semester is useful to help you explain the policy that you're working with. The greatest policy theory minds have not settled on a single policy model, institution model, or even way of teaching policy making. So you have some leeway in structuring your understanding, but that doesn't mean you don't have to know what we're talking about here. It means that you should know what we're talking about here and then pick your team, or at least pick the team that's going to help you answer your question effectively. I did a nice little review of ideas. Yeah, so all of these are concepts that we talked about in this section. And I strongly encourage you going forward to keep referring back to this theory of policy making, because if you don't have a theory of how policy is made, it is going to limit the applicability of anything you do on your paper. Hopefully what happens is that in writing the paper that you're writing, it gives you an idea of how you are going to understand public policy making in the rest of your career.